everyone, and welcome to the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida podcast, the Just Economy podcast. Welcome back for another podcast. We got a great guest this morning. We'll be getting to him shortly, but before we get to him, we want to make a few announcements. First of all, as you well know, this is the Just Economy podcast, building a just economy for Florida, and we will work to provide different viewpoints, different ideas, and different suggestions to make our economy better, to make our people better, and to make our communities better. So this morning, we have a great guest. And by the way, my name is Cornell Cruz Jr. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida and your host for the Just Economy podcast. We have a great guest he's actually head of policy at the NCRC. His name is Dedrick Asante-Muhammad. Very smart gentleman. I depend on him a lot for the work that has to be done in the community and how we can better frame it. And we're going to have a very deep discussion this morning about several items, and most importantly, the racial wealth gap. So, Dedrick, I want to welcome you. Thank you for coming on. Dedrick, there's one thing I do with every guest, and that is I'd like to know a little bit about your history. How did you get where you are now?
Yeah, well, I have grew up in Maryland, born in New York City, but grew up in Maryland. I was always interested in racial equality, read a lot of King, read most of King's work by the age of 13, and I started reading some of Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael, Charles Hamilton's Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, found a very important, helpful book. Going over, really getting into institutional racism, defining institutional racism, really helped me understand more the economics of racial inequality, as did Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? So was interested in that, did political science in college. I've always been very interested in religion, got a master's in religion, I got a master's in religion. I was working with Reverend Sharpton. I eventually started working for Reverend Sharpton, and I was noticing, and this is the early 2000s, how much he engaged around economics, though not so much on the TV. At that time, he was more known for his police brutality work. And then a position opened up called Racial Wealth Divide Coordinator at a small nonprofit in Boston, United for a Fair Economy, and took that position and have ever since stayed in that area as I've moved from organization to organization, United for a Fair Economy, to a think tank, Institute for Policy Studies, to the NAACP, to a group called Prosperity Now, and now at NCRC. But as I say oftentimes, I have found that the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. So it's been a space where I've wanted to stay focused.
Well, Dedrick, I can tell you we're grateful for your service, and we're grateful for your studying on this subject. The reason why I wanted to bring you on and talk about the racial wealth gap, because actually when it first came out, I was stunned after I read it. Although I knew a lot of the things, I was still stunned,
Yeah.
And then I guess what's been even more stunning for me is the lack of it being put out into the ether. I'm a firm believer it's out of sight, out of mind. If you don't think about it, then don't recognize it, then it will continue to happen. And we're going to get into some of those things that are continuing to happen to exacerbate the racial wealth divide, which is something that hurts this country more than people know. And I think the reason why it hurts this country more than people know is because we're not talking about it. We also get to the point where, okay, well, Cornell, I'm tired of hearing that. And I get this when I'm in meetings, especially anything around race. I get this in meeting all the time. Well, we're past that. Obviously not. Or we wouldn't be here. So
that's the point of the report. Yeah,
exactly. So in your report, one of the you had several key findings. And in a few areas, you talked about African Americans have made substantial social economic advancements since the 1960s. Can you talk about a little bit about what those things were, those substantial social economic advancements were?
Sure, yeah. And I thought it was important to note I like to highlight the problem, but I also like to highlight, where there has been progress. And two, I think it's important to understand where we've come from in the last 60 years. This report was written on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There was an economic analysis of racial inequality, pretty much ever since we've been here. But where we've seen some great progress from around that time period, early 1960s, has been in terms of poverty rates. I think that was one of the things that I didn't quite understand, that in 1963, blacks had a poverty rate, and that looks at income, of 51%, and for whites was 15%. And what's pretty amazing is how quickly it went down after the war on poverty by 69. I think it was for African Americans in the high 30s. Just within like 6-7 years, there's a dramatic decrease in poverty rates for African Americans. And in 2021, we had the black poverty rate at about 20%. So, that's still high. It's still one out of 5 blacks are living in poverty. But if you just think about that, in 60 years ago, it was the majority of African Americans were living in income poverty. You can see the deep economic insecurity that most of us live in. And to, be in income poverty, you can be a household of 2 and be having, I don't know, making like $15,000, $16,000 a year. So it's very minimal income. So had progress in the decrease in poverty. We've had a progress in education. A high school attainment moved for African Americans from about 25% to 90% in 2022, almost pretty much bridging the black-white high school graduation divide, pretty much. Where we still have substantive inequality is in college attainment, though we have seen that in the 60s, whites were about 2.4 times more likely to have a college degree than blacks. In 2022, they're about 1.7 times. So, there's been an increase in black educational attainment, a decrease in the inequality, but there's still substantive inequality in college attainment. And then most recently in unemployment. For the last 4 or 5 years, outside of the COVID recession, we've been having, pretty near record level rates of unemployment, hitting around 6%, which we hadn't hit since 1961, and even breaking the record, getting down to around 5%. Unemployment. Historically, up until about 2016, 2018, African Americans regularly had 2 times the unemployment rate of whites. Now it's gone down a bit to around 1.7 times, those types of things. So we've seen some progress in educational attainment, in declining poverty rates, and most recently in bridging unemployment disparities.
Okay, so Dedrick, you mentioned something earlier that really hit me. You said how at the time of the war on poverty in the late 60s that it actually dropped. So would you say that the war on poverty actually worked at that particular time?
No, that's a really important piece you're bringing up, because so much of, I'd say, the 80s through 2000s was this narrative about how the war on poverty failed, or not even that just the war on poverty failed, that the war on poverty made poverty worse, right? And it was this whole, and this is, had this whole regressive Reagan era, 80s through 2010. Some people say it just started ending in 2018, where the idea is that government was really the problem, government programs were the problem, and the way to bridge disparities is to end government programs. But what we've seen in that 40-year period, 1980 to 2020, is ongoing racial inequality and growing economic inequality overall. So yes, I do think we have to look at the war on poverty as substantially lowering poverty rates for blacks and whites, and the small Latino population, Native American population at that time. I think the challenge is it brought things down. But once we get to about 1980, we didn't continue to bring poverty rates down. And we've kind of just been stuck at this 10% level for the national population, 20% level for African Americans.
So that brings up another question.
Yep.
So what do you think caused it to stop? That we're now been at the same level, since 1980, you said? or the 90s. What caused it to stop? If you see something working, you would think that you would keep doing it, right? So why do you think it's what do you think caused it to stop? And do you think it was purposeful?
Yeah, interesting. So what I think we had in coming out of the Great Depression in the 30s, there was a recognition that mass government intervention was necessary to address the economy, the economic lives of most Americans. And so there were mass government programs, work programs, education programs, changing things for even home ownership, building, all of these things. That was recognized, and it had a radical effect on the American economy, the American people, really creating American middle class lifestyle that really didn't exist, mostly for white Americans, but still didn't exist for white Americans really pre that period. So that kind of whole New Deal energy. And then I think what you found in the 1960s is you found a mixture of a ongoing post-World War II booming economy with very low unemployment rates, a booming economy, rising up everyone, as well as well into the Black freedom movement of the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement, where outright legal segregation was being torn down, and there was more opportunity than previous for African Americans to enter into public institutions that they had been denied before. So the New Deal helped create a lot of these public institutions, but then you have the 1950s and 1960s where African Americans are being more allowed to benefit from these public institutions, public investments, which allowed us to, even disproportionately decrease our poverty rates, even disproportionately increase education. Public education really opened all of these things. And there was a backlash. There was a backlash, pretty much as soon as it started. And I think you saw a national political backlash with the election of Nixon, though Nixon and his law and order seems like a leftist compared to later Republican leaders like Ronald Reagan, even George Bush Jr., and the most recent iteration of Donald Trump. Because even Nixon, with his backlash of law and order, was willing to create really advanced affirmative action programs, create black empowerment programs through his black capitalism space, which you can be critical of. But even that was much more progressive and aimed at addressing black inequality than what would happen later in the 1980s, when they really dismantled most of the civil rights infrastructure that had been built and had been an ongoing pushback that has, I think, the mixture of less government, less taxation, allowing for greater concentration of wealth as a whole, as well as dismantling whatever programs were developed to help particularly address the issues of inequality for African Americans.
Exactly the answer I expected to hear from you. I think a lot of people don't realize that even when you look at Nixon and for all the bad things that he did, mostly to his party and to himself, but most of the bad things he did. He started the EPA so we could can have better drinking water. He developed some of the federal lands for parks and stuff and things of this nature. So some of the things that he did were good, that have benefited us all and not just African Americans, not along with some of the programs that you discussed.
And if I could just jump in there, and I think too, it just shows so much how a national pull affects everyone. So the national pull was government intervention, progressive politics, uplifting everyone. So even when you're having a conservative backlash, it's conservative relative to the New Deal and Roosevelt and these types of things, and to Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, and to mass civil rights movement. We kind of, from the 1980s on, the kind of Democrat was kind of being liberal in a conservative environment. So we weren't really ever getting the deep investments that we had gotten mid 20th century. So just wanted to share that.
I agree.